So when I first played Starfield, I had a lot of impressions of the game. One of the biggest ones for me was that the aliens in the game were kind of boring, a little uninspired. I'm of course talking about the alien fauna in the game, as there are no sentient aliens. At least in my experience, probably 70% of the animals I encounter normally in Starfield were coral bugs, which are cool but get boring after a while. Besides that, if you do the quest, you meet some other ones like Ashta, Sirens, Terramorphs, and Aciles, which are pretty interesting, but again, that's 4 species. So if you would have told me that this game has over 200 alien animal species, I would have said that's bullshit, and to be fair, it is kind of bullshit. A good chunk of them are reskin or resizes of other animals, but there are still so many more animals in this game than I thought. And the worst part is that most players will never see the best of them through normal gameplay. So I decided to go through all 204 of them that I could find on the various Starfield wikis and rate them 1 to 10. A rating of 1 for me just means it's kind of an uninspired design, a 5 means it's pretty good, and 10 is like, what the hell even is that and how did somebody think of that? So mainly I'm going to be factoring in their designs, but also their names. Also be speculating on the behavior of some of these animals because I think it's fun, and also comparing them to their Earth counterparts. We're going in alphabetical order, which means the first animal is one I already mentioned in the intro. Aciles. If you played the United Colonies quest in this game, you probably know the Aciles, but if you don't, they're these fucking gigantic armored beaked creatures. It's actually extinct by the time of Starfield. That is because humans apparently farmed these things and ended up killing them all during a war. Now that is probably one of the stupidest pieces of lore in this game, because that would be like if humans farmed rhinos or elephants. Like, yeah, you could do that, but also that's an insanely dangerous farm animal. Especially when there are other much smaller mammal creatures in this game that would make much better farm animals. Anyway, the Aciles prey on Terramorphs, which are the main villain of the aforementioned questline, and for that and their size, I'll give the Aciles a 6. Pretty cool, but trust me when I say there are much crazier aliens coming. Ankylosaurus. The Ankylosaurus looks a lot like its real-world dinosaur counterpart, just with a different head shape and more eyes. Now, I do like this design, but it's a little uninspired in my opinion, given that it is just a slightly modified real-world dinosaur. I'll give it a 3 out of 10. Angler. The angler is a crab-like insect creature that gets its name due to the glowing lure that hangs out in front of its face. One of the most interesting things about the angler is that it seems to have wings, kind of like a beetle. So I'd imagine the angler hides in dark spaces like caves where you can only see its lure, then when prey gets close enough it jumps out on them. It would be very scary to see this thing fly, but it probably couldn't go very far. I'll give the angler a 5 out of 10 because there are a lot of crab-like animals in this game. Anteater. The anteater looks a lot like the ones we have on Earth, except it seems to be a reptile rather than a mammal. There's this trend with Starfield's fauna that is basically taking an Earth mammal and making it into an alien reptile, which works I guess, but it results in very few creatures in Starfield actually having fur, which I think is pretty unrealistic. I like the anteater's mustache though, so I'll give it a 3 out of 10. Arapaima. Arapaima are one of my favorite fish in the real world. They're these huge freshwater fish in South America that actually breathe air, not water. As a river monsters enjoyer, I don't really understand why they called this Arapaima. It looks much more like a catfish to me, but it does seem to be a freshwater fish and it might even breathe air. Starfield's Arapaima have algae and fungus growing on their back, so they probably lurk in pretty swampy environments and don't move very much. One of the reasons real Arapaima breathe air is so they can survive droughts, when the water recedes and they're left lurking in shallow pools with almost no oxygen in the water. This seems like a similar situation, so I guess I can see why Bethesda called it that. I'll give the Arapaima a 7 out of 10. Arachnofly. The arachnofly is a foul creature in every sense of the word. I mean, what the hell? So you can see its eyes are fly-like, which is where it got the name, although I would argue it's more of a crab fly. That name was already taken though, so they had to call it arachnofly. It has these like pustules with little hair growing out of them, which lines up with the fly name. The hair, that is, not the pustules. Its mouth is also pretty foul looking and has these limbs extending out of it, which would presumably be used to pull prey into their mouth, which is lined with tentacles or maybe stingers. Very gross design, but I like it. 7 out of 10. Arachnomantis. The Arachnomantis has a body layout that we'll see a lot in Starfield, where they have 2 gigantic forelimbs that they hold on top of their body, posed to strike at any moment. The Arachnomantis is a spider-like creature with those aforementioned forelimbs that are shaped like a praying mantis's claws. You can see how lethal those things would be if it hit you with enough force. The rest of it is more or less spider-like, besides that I think it has its eyes on the knees of its front and back legs, which is actually a really smart design for this body layout. Because as we'll see later, not all bugs with this layout got so lucky. I like the Arachnomantis, I'll give it a 6 out of 10. Artichoke. The artichoke has a very accurate name, as it does kind of look like a floating artichoke. Now in our real world, filter feeding outside of water isn't really a possibility, we just don't have enough microorganisms in the air to sustain creatures like that. In Starfield though, that is actually a pretty common strategy, which makes sense as a lot of these plants will give you instant bronchitis should you take off your spacesuit. The artichoke is a very accurate name, but among the floating animals of Starfield, it's on the boring side. I'll give it a 4 out of 10. Ashta. The Ashta are these reptile creatures that are apparently so fearsome that they're the reason why Aquila City is a rundown shithole, despite being the capital of one of the 3 major factions in Starfield. The main reason for that is that they travel in packs, so while one Ashta isn't really a big deal, 20 of them is a different story. Ashta look pretty cool. I really like the way their head looks, but I think the overall design is very boring, and it doesn't make much sense that these things are so fearsome. Terramorphs are similarly feared, but those things have mind control. Ashta are just like lizard wolves, and there are way too many of those in Starfield. 2 out of 10.
B.
Baleen rotifer. The The baleen rotifer is another floating filter feeder that has maybe one of the most puzzling names in the game. So baleen is the brush-like thing inside whales' mouth that they use to feed. A rotifer is a microorganism that are also called wheel animals, because they have these mouth parts that whip around little cilia or tails to create a current and draw in water to filter feed. It kind of looks like a wheel, which is where they get the name. The baleen rotifer neither has baleen or is a rotifer, so I have no idea what they were going for with this. 1 out of 10. Bear claw. The bear claw also has kind of a weird name, but it has the same body plan as the arachnomantis, just with slightly smaller claws. The bear claw is much more tarantula-like, with fur covering its body. It also has these spikes all over it to protect it from predators, and also probably use it to hunt. Some real-world tarantulas can throw their hairs at potential predators, causing irritation and hopefully saving their life. Perhaps these spikes on the bear claw are its form of urticating hairs they can throw at things. The bear claw has its eyes facing forward, which also works with those giant arms. I'll give it a 6 out of 10 to match with the arachnomantis. Beetle. The beetle actually looks more like a horseshoe crab or maybe a horseshoe crab roach to me. It has a very flat body and would be pretty hard to see if I spawned it in an environment that wasn't so grassy. I think the beetle is cute, so I'll give it a 3 out of 10. Beetle crab. Beetle crab is pretty interesting. Now the actual thing itself does more or less fit with its name. It's kind of a giant beetle with crab legs. However, on its shell are these really weird outcroppings. It almost looks like the beetle crab has plants growing out of its shell. I think these could serve a couple purposes. First of all, I don't think the beetle crab eats those plants, as I don't think it could reach. Maybe though it's a mutualistic relationship where the plants secrete some kind of chemical that might keep predators away or prevent parasites. Meanwhile, the beetle crab prevents the plants from being eaten and brings it to bright new pastures to spread its seeds. It could also be more commensalistic, where the crab just happens to have holes on its back that get clogged up with plants, but it doesn't really care as those holes weren't doing much anyway. Of course, it could also be parasitic and the beetle crab is in immense pain at all hours of the day. Either way, I'll give it a 7 out of 10. Bighorn. The bighorn kind of looks like Alduin from Skyrim in my opinion. It's this dark black reptile creature with, as you guessed, big horns. The bighorn is very heavily armored, which it probably needs because it is a herbivore that isn't 12 feet tall. I like this design though. The bighorn gets an 8 out of 10. Bladeback. The bladeback is a very unique looking creature and I honestly don't know how to describe it besides the fact that yes, it does have blade-like protrusions sticking out of its back. It's definitely a reptile of some kind as it looks kind of dinosaur-y. If I had to guess, I would say the blade serves kind of a camouflage, make it kind of look like a rock. Or maybe the bladeback comes from a planet with giant birds that could pick it up off the ground if it didn't have them. Either way, for a very fitting name and accurate design, I'll give the bladeback an 8 out of 10. Bladehead. The bladehead is another fish with kind of an odd-looking design. Again though, the inspiration behind the name is very clear as it does have a head shaped like a blade. The bladehead almost looks like a tadpole. It only has 2 fins and a tail, and also that big-ass head probably helps it swim straight. I think it kind of looks like Tiktaalik, which was one of the first fish that could walk on land, which means it's the species responsible for you having to pay taxes now. Bladehead doesn't look exactly like it though, however I do like the design, 7 out of 10. Blister crab. The blister crab looks pretty ordinary from the back until you get a look at that face and it's like, whoa. It has 4 tentacles coming out of its mouth, which it probably uses to get its food. I would guess the blister crab eats other crabs, mollusks, snails, and that type of thing, rooting them out of the sand with those tentacles and carrying them into its mouth to be eaten. Its eyes are also interesting because they have more tentacles or maybe spikes coming off of them. Maybe it's called blister crab because if it touches you with its eyes, you blister up. I don't know, but I'll give it a 7 out of 10. Boneback. The boneback is a pretty odd-looking weevil-like creature. Most of it just looks like your average everyday giant insect, except for the bones sticking out of its back. On the end of the bone are these little holes, which I'm not entirely sure what the purpose of them is. It doesn't seem to be its eyes, it has those on stalks. Its mouth is pretty similar to something you might see on a normal weevil, but yeah, that bone thing is pretty odd. I'll give the boneback a 6 out of 10. Bone frill. The bone frill is another massive reptile creature that kind of looks like Alduin from Skyrim, but the coolest part about this animal is it has 3 pairs of eyes, each a different color. The bone frill gets its name from the giant bone growth sticking out of its back, which make an already massive creature look even bigger. See, now this is the kind of animal that could cause a capital city to fall in a squalor. I'm a fan. I'll give the bone frill a 9 out of 10. Bone glider. The bone glider is kind of a strange looking sting or maybe manta ray. It gets its name from its almost emaciated appearance. Besides that and its pretty unique coloring, there's not much going on here. I'll give the bone glider a 3 out of 10. Bone mane. The bone mane is pretty odd looking. It kind of has a weasel looking face placed on top of this super long neck. It's called bone mane because of the weird mane that it has. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but I don't think you ever really see this on Earth, where you have bones and skins kind of jutting out like that in various directions without any kind of connective tissue in between. I think the main reason we don't have that is because there would probably have to be an evolutionary pressure for an animal to adapt that. The only one I can really think of is that it's attractive to potential mates. I find the bone mane both kind of cute and gross, so I'll give it a 5 out of 10. Bone shell. The bone shell is a cricket/grasshopper looking thing that does indeed have a hard shell made out of bone. What's interesting are these large holes that you can see in its shell. So grasshoppers breathe through small holes in their bodies called spiracles. You can actually see these on the bone shell's tail. What I'm thinking though is that that's what those larger holes are as well. I'll give the bone shell a 5 out of 10. Brainsprout. Next up is the Brainsprout, and here's the interesting thing about Brainsprouts. 2 animals share that name, however they cannot look more different. The pack Brainsprout is more or less just a typical lizard. However, the Brainsprout herbivore looks like this. So what's going on here? Are these 2 separate animals given one name due to Bethesda's incompetence? I don't think so, because it doesn't really make sense for the pack Brainsprouts to be called that unless they turn into the Brainsprout herbivore. I believe that the herbivore is a version of the Brainsprout infected by a type of parasitic fungus, which is what gave the species that name, as only the herbivores have things sprouting from the brain. So the fungus infects a pack Brainsprout and turns it into this bloated, disgusting creature. The new sprout obviously has the fungus sprouting from its now fly-like eyes, but you can now see holes all over its body where mycelia from the fungus are poking out. Now we have two options here. Either the fungus drastically changed the Brainsprout's body and is now keeping it alive in constant suffering, or the fungus killed the Brainsprout and is now piloting around its dead body for its own means. I lean more towards the latter, as that can be seen on Earth in cordyceps fungus infecting ants and spiders. The main difference here though is that the infected Brainsprouts seem to be able to live on their own for at least a while and sustain themselves. So the fungus takes over the Brainsprout's body, killing the original animal but keeping its body from rotting, so that the fungus can pilot it around and spread its spores. Very cool animal. I'll give the Brainsprout a 10 out of 10. Brain Squid / Dropsalm. The brain squid, also known as the dropsalm, is a massive 6-limbed land cephalopod of some kind. Now why does it have two names? I don't know. Brain squid is very accurate, but I honestly prefer dropsalm as that gives you absolutely no idea of what you're getting into. Like imagine you show up to Starfield science class and your teacher's like, today we're working with the dropsalm, and out comes one of these monsters. Anyway, the brain squid is a massive land cephalopod that has a large wrinkled head that resembles a brain. If you look at where its beak is, you can see these 4 kind of tusks surrounding it. I think those might have at one point in their evolutionary history been tentacles, meaning it would have the customary 10 limbs that our squids have. Of course, none of our cephalopods can live on land, so maybe it's not a great comparison, but anyway, the brain squid has an absolutely lethal look to it, and you can easily see how this thing could dispatch and eat a human with very little difficulty. I'll give the brain squid / dropsalm a 9 out of 10. Brain blimp. The brain blimp is another floater that kind of has a goofy look to it, but you can easily see how this thing floats as its head seems to be filled with gas, like a blimp. A brain blimp, perhaps. I think the brain blimp resembles the flatworms of Earth, specifically the ones that kind of glide or float their way through the water. Only of course with the adaptation of an inflated head allowing it to glide through the air. I like the brain blimp, I'll give it a 7 out of 10. Bright cage. Bright cages are these little spider-like bugs that get the name from the fact that on their back is what looks like a cage around a central ball of thread. What's inside that thread is anybody's guess, but mine is that it's an egg sac, and when the babies hatch they'll all go streaming out from inside the cage. This is all speculation, but I think it's likely bright cages only look like this when they're holding an egg sac. Like once a bright cage female gets impregnated, its back kind of expands outwards, fracturing and forming a cage to hold its egg sac within. Kinda gross, but I think it's a cool design. 7 out of 10. Buzz Runner. The Buzz Runner is a really cool and interesting looking animal. I just can't really fathom why they're called that. Anyway, the Buzz Runner has 6 limbs, 2 for walking and 4 for grabbing, which has never been seen in Earth's land vertebrates because we all evolved from a common fish ancestor which had 4 fins. Its tail also splits at the end into 3, but by far the most interesting part of the Buzz Runner is its head. It has a giant crest that splits out from either side of its head and these massive mandibles that it could use to grab its prey. I'll give the Buzz Runner an 8 out of 10.
See in my reorn.
Cage Brain. The cage brain is kind of built like a reptilian giraffe except for the most obvious difference, that being its exposed brain inside of a cage on its head. The cage brain's neck is heavily armored and has some pretty nasty teeth on it, so the brain is well protected from the bottom, but pretty much exposed to the world on the top. Its brain also has a pretty unique shape. It's pretty narrow and kind of curves upwards. This is a really weird adaptation. If I had to guess at a purpose, I would say the cage brain comes from a pretty cold planet and one that lacks any aerial predators, meaning that it can just air cool its brain like that. It's probably an adaptation that developed way in the past on their planet, and the cage brain slowly evolved a bigger and stronger neck to keep its exposed brain out of the reach of any predators. A really crazy design. I'll give it an 8 out of 10. Canard. The canard is an animal that you're going to watch soar through the air in my footage, however they can also spawn in the water, so I think that's more where they're supposed to be. I would guess the canard is like a manta ray. They can jump out of the water and glide for a while before going back in. The canard has no eyes that I can see on it, but other than that it looks to me like an alien form of a ray that we have here on Earth. Just maybe a little better at flying. 5 out of 10. Snail. The snail is not a snail, it has legs, but besides that it's a very interesting design. The snail either has a shell that's meant to look like wood or is inside a piece of wood, with its 12 eyes and 2 long tentacles poking out from holes in the shell. Besides that, I think the snail is pretty cute. I'll give it a 4 out of 10. Cassowary. Cassowary kind of looks like the earth animal it's named after, of course with the biggest difference being that it flies. It's a lot more pterodactyl-like than the cassowaries we have here on Earth, but what we really have to hope is that this massive flying lizard doesn't have the temperament of Earth's cassowaries, as those things are menaces. I'll give Starfield's cassowary a 3 out of 10. Caterpillar. Earth's caterpillars come in pretty much every shape and size you could imagine, so Starfield's caterpillar is fighting an uphill battle to be unique. It is much larger than anything we have on Earth, so you have to wonder what kind of monster moth that thing is going to turn into. With most caterpillars, the way they look is entirely to ward off predators. A lot of them are venomous, while just as many pretend to be more dangerous than they actually are. It's hard to say exactly what Starfield's caterpillar is trying to do since we don't know what its predators are, but I'll give it a 5 out of 10 for being an accurate caterpillar. Cephalopod. The biologists of Starfield didn't have a lot of creativity when they named the cephalopod. Like, yeah, that name works, but you could have easily called it a land octopus or something. Like I said with the brain squid, we don't have any land cephalopods here on Earth. However, in Starfield, it seems that to be on the land, a cephalopod must only have 6 limbs. Unlike the brain squid, this one has its beak in the usual place and pretty much looks just like an octopus, except it's lacking any kind of suckers on its tentacles. For being a perfectly adequate land octopus, I'll give the cephalopod a 5 out of 10. Centiskull. The centiskull is named that because it has many legs and a shell that resembles a skull. Okay, only problem is that that is a crab, not a centipede in any way, shape, or form. Perhaps centicrab would have been a better name. Either way, if I was a bird flying above a beach looking for a poor innocent crab to eat, I would definitely think the centiskull was a rock. I'll give it a 3 out of 10. Chasm bass. You can't actually find chasm bass alive in the wild in Starfield because the planet they're on, Volii Alpha, is purely ocean. The only place you can find them is fished up in Neon City where they're used to make drugs. Anyway, my first thought when seeing a chasm bass is the extinct helicorpian shark, which scientists think had a circular saw-like teeth layout. I don't know why they're called bass, as chasm bass look nothing like any kind of bass we have on Earth. They are massive plated bony fish though, and not sharks, so maybe they couldn't think of anything else. Now when it comes to fish in Starfield, this game doesn't really have any reliable way to explore the water, which is why the very few fish you can find are always in the shallows near shore. It would be awesome though if you could dive down into the deep ocean on some of these planets, especially entirely ocean planets like Volii Alpha, and see what's down there. I'll give the chasm bass a 6 out of 10. Click beetle. Click beetles are a real kind of beetles that look nothing like the Starfield creature, which I don't even think is a beetle. It has that same kind of grasshopper layout, although definitely more alien this time. I'm not an expert, but I think it probably uses those massive upper limbs to create some kind of crazy sounds to attract mates. The click beetle is very unique, I'll give it a 6 out of 10. Clawback. The clawback is another pretty typical looking crab except for the, you probably guessed it, claws on its back. Well, not exactly claws, but they are little appendage type things that have a sort of knuckle, so the clawback can likely move these things around. To me, it also looks like the claws are capable of making a sound, so maybe that's how they draw in mates. I'll give it a solid 5 out of 10. Cobalt. The cobalt is our next floater, and it's a strange one. The cobalt is a very slightly translucent ball of jelly that floats through the air filter feeding. My only real gripe with cobalt is that that shit is not cobalt, that is purple. 5 out of 10. Cockatrice. Cockatrice is a tiny pterosaur that bears almost no resemblance to the mythological creature that it's named after. The cockatrice in mythology was basically supposed to be a dragon with the head of a rooster, but this thing is just a cute little pterosaur. 2 out of 10. Coral crawler. The coral crawler is a very interesting looking insect, has a very alien exoskeleton look to it, only compounded by what seems to be fungus growing in these grooves along the coral crawler. I think it's possible that these are also its eggs growing there, as they kind of look like eggs. I feel like a coral crawler would be something you see on a super barren planet, like one that can barely sustain life in the first place, but somehow these skeletal egg-bearing bugs survive. They're very cool looking. 8 out of 10. Coral bug. Next is a similarly named coral bug, but maybe this is my personal Starfield experience, but I feel like these things are a galactic pest. Except for maybe xenogrubs, they're by far the most common random enemy encounter for me. I mean, maybe xenogrubs grow into coral bugs, I don't know. Given how widespread they are and that they seem to be native to Jemison, the capital of the United Colonies, I think humans accidentally spread these things to every corner of the galaxy. Their face looks like a flower, which is probably used to lure in prey, and their body looks enough like a plant to hide them well enough. Coral bugs are almost always found in packs, so imagine if you were a herbivore looking for food and you stumble across this field of beautiful blue flowers, only to find out that it was actually coral bugs and now you're getting ripped apart. I'll give them a 9 out of 10. Coral bucket. The coral bucket is our next floater, and it's one of the bigger ones. You can see where its gas bags are in the bottom of it, which leaves the entire upper part as the titular coral bucket. On top of the bucket is its mouth opening, which actually looks like it might have kind of a beak or a radula, which suggests that the bucket might not be a pure filter feeder. Maybe it floats up to trees and nibbles on fruits or leaves. That would also explain why the bucket part is so big, as it would need digestive organs. Backing that up is that it has tentacles to ward off predators attacking from below. I like the coral bucket, I'll give it a 7 out of 10. Coral crab. The coral crab is next, and just ignore that other thing. The crab is the one with the giant forelimbs. It seems to be a lot like the spiders with that layout, which makes sense as crabs and spiders are both arthropods. The coral crab gets its name from these chimney-like things on its back where it looks like it stores its eggs. So once the eggs are ready, all the crab would have to do is crawl into the water and release them. I'll give it a 5 out of 10. Coralheart. The Coralheart is somewhat similar to the coral crawler, except rather than having fungal growth all over it, its body grows into the shape of a heart. It's kinda cute if I'm being honest, despite the fact that the Coralheart itself is a pretty weird looking insect. I'll give it a 6 out of 10. Crab. The animal simply named crab, or maybe herding crab if you want to be technical, is pretty much just that, it's a giant crab. It even has the right number of limbs this time, that being 10. I don't have much to say about the crab other than it would probably taste good. 1 out of 10. Crabfly. I mentioned the crabfly earlier in the arachnofly section, and I want you to decide which one looks weirder, that or the crabfly. I don't know, because the arachnofly is disgusting, but this thing is just so uncanny. It has these gigantic fly-like eyes. I mean, I can't even imagine how far this thing can see with those eyes. It has no pincers or arms of any kind, apparently relying entirely on detection when it comes to finding prey and dealing with predators. I decided to let the crabfly attack me to see what its hunting strategy is, and it's exactly what you'd expect. Slamming its giant head into you, 9 out of 10. Crag Sprinter. So the Crag Sprinter I think is kind of a reference to the Cliff Racer from Morrowind, but besides that it has a massive mouth that opens up on the sides. It's kind of like a pelican, but instead of having a giant pouch, it just has a massive mouth. You can definitely see how this thing would get you though, as if you were a little rabbit or fish or something. I'll give it a 5 out of 10. Crane Hopper. The Crane Hopper is another grasshopper-like insect. It does have a pretty cool coloring though, and a weird looking face with those big blue eyes. I'll give it a 5 out of 10. Crawling Eurypterid. The Crawling Eurypterid kind of just looks like an isopod to me, but actual Eurypterids are an extinct group of arthropods called the sea scorpions. You've probably seen them before if you like paleontology. Now I don't really think this thing looks like a Eurypterid at all. It's a cute little creature, so I'll give it a 3. Crocodont. The Crocodont reminds me of the skull crawlers from Kong Skull Island. I really like this design. This thing looks like it would rip you to shreds within seconds of seeing you. Just the way it stands there panting like a maniac is sick to me. Anyway, the Crocodont has 6 eyes and plate armor covering its front side, meaning that you'd have trouble killing it as it's charging straight at you. It also looks fast as fuck, but it doesn't really have any kind of neck to speak of, so I would say it probably can't turn very easily once it starts running. Either way, I like the Crocodont. It gets a 9 out of 10. Cricket. This thing is so weirdly named because that shit is not at all a cricket. It's very clearly a praying mantis. Let's just move past the stupid naming scheme to talk about the massive mouth on this cricket. Now, a giant praying mantis would already be an apex predator, but one that also has a mouth large enough to fit your entire head in it is even worse. I'll give the cricket a 5 out of 10. Cutterhead. Cutterheads are very dopey looking herbivores. They get their name from the 2 blade-like bone growths sticking out from the top and bottom of their head. I don't really have too much to say about cutterheads besides how goofy they look. 4 out of 10. Cyclozard. The Cyclozard is another very goofy looking animal, however it's not the Pokemon Cyclozar that doubles as a bike, rather it's this one-eyed lizard. Thus it's being named after the Cyclops, not cycling. Now, as far as I can tell, no reptiles on Earth only have one eye, and honestly very few large animals in general only have one eye, but there must have been some kind of advantage to it. Either that or on the planet Cyclozard comes from, animals never evolved multiple eyes. Either way, I'll give the Cyclops a 4 out of 10.
Duster.
Dodo. The dodo is like a much larger scaled version of the extinct Earth bird that it's named after. Dodos on Earth went extinct due to habitat destruction and overhunting, but I have a feeling that the latter of those wouldn't be a big problem for this dodo. My only real complaint here is that I wish they would have gone for a more terror bird design, where it had feathers rather than scales. I'll give the dodo a 6 out of 10. Dragon. The dragon is somewhat oddly named because it doesn't have any wings, but it's the next lizard wolf, as I've been calling them, or basically just a quadruped lizard with not much else going on besides that. The dragon is very spiky though, and I like the green color, so I'll give it a 4 out of 10. Dragodon. The Dragodon is a sauropod looking thing that kind of has a face that looks like a goblin. The most interesting thing here is that it has breathing holes all along its neck. Maybe the Dragodon hunts fish so it can just take its head into the water and wait for a passing fish to snatch, all the while breathing through its neck. I'll give the Dragodon a 7 out of 10. Dragonfly. The Dragonfly is pretty much just that, except that it's fully aquatic, so it obviously doesn't have any wings. It's also lacking the fly eyes that usual dragonflies have due to it being underwater like that. It's alright, I'll give it a 5 out of 10. Drone. The drone is pretty odd looking and makes a gross sound as it floats around. But kind of like the coral bucket, you can clearly see where its gas bags are that allow it to float. Also like the bucket, it has a mouth on the top of its body, leading me to believe that it probably eats fruits or leaves off trees, rather than filter feeding like most floaters in this game. I'll give it a 6 out of 10. Dust Devil Exarunner. The Dust Devil Exarunner is a massive plated creature that looks very fearsome. It has 6 eyes to make up for the fact that I don't really think each eye can see particularly well on its own. Like the Crocodon, it stands there panting like a maniac, while this one does seem to have a neck, meaning you probably couldn't juke it as easily. I'll give it a 7 out of 10. Earback. The earback doesn't seem to actually have an ear on its back, however it does have a massive floppy fringe that kind of does look like an ear. Just by looking at it, I would guess the earback is pretty much a scavenger. I would say it probably eats similar to pigs, which is to say anything. I would also guess its massive fringe is probably to appeal to mates, like the bigger your fringe is, the bigger Chad you are. 6 out of 10. Eggback. The eggback is a reptile that, like the Suriname toad in real life, carries its eggs on its back. Now, I find the whole visual of baby frogs coming out of a toad's back to be disgusting, and it makes my skin crawl, so I'm not going to show any videos. But I think this is a similar thing, where the babies would hatch right there and crawl out of its back. Despite the similarity to the toad, this thing looks very alien. 8 out of 10. Egg sac. The egg sac is a floating jellyfish-like creature that I think kind of looks like the Winter Lanterns from Bloodborne. It does indeed carry its eggs all over its body, and just by looking at it, I don't know if this thing survives the hatching of the eggs. It seems like when an egg sac gets impregnated, the eggs grow over its entire body, and its whole purpose then is to carry them, and then die once they hatch. 7 out of 10. Eggtail. I'll give you 3 guesses where the eggtail keeps its eggs. Yeah, right on its tail. The most interesting thing about the eggtail to me is the leopard print pattern on its sides. I actually think it's kind of pretty. The upper part of the reptile is wrinkly and gross, but the underside is pretty. 5 out of 10. Elk Krangan / Hippodon. The elk Krangan and the Hippodon look almost identical, just with the former being green and mossy, and the latter being hippo-colored. I'm just going to group them together. So both are mammals, which is rare in Starfield. We know this because they actually have nipples, which means they produce milk to feed their children. Now remember earlier when I said that humans in Starfield farmed the Asylees, the giant plated reptiles? Well, since nobody in Starfield had the foresight to bring any earth animals like cows with them when they left, I think the Krangan would have been a suitable replacement. I mean, they're big, fat, herbivorous, and not quite as big or fearsome as Earth's hippos, and they produce milk. Now, if you were to ask me if I want to drink alien hippo milk, my answer would be no. That's because I live on Earth, not Jemison or Aquila. I'll give the elk Krangan / Hippodon a 6 out of 10. Exocrawler. The Exocrawler is very unsettling to look at, and I think these could easily be the villains of a sci-fi horror movie. Basically giant barbed scorpion creatures, which doesn't sound that interesting, but just look at the thing. I'll give it a 9 out of 10. Exo Whale. The Exo Whale looks like a creature out of H.R. Geiger's art. The name is pretty accurate as it is a whale with an exoskeleton. I think the most interesting thing about it is the Exo Whale's mouth. So it has these two little outcroppings which look like they would direct water towards its mouth, however it does not seem to be a filter feeder as it has those sharp teeth. I think the Exo Whale probably feeds on small fish and shrimp that can manage to get into its mouth without them swimming away. I'll give the Exo Whale a 9 out of 10. Eye Spine. The eye spine is a kind of goofy looking reptile with customary 2 eyes on its face, but then 6 more on either side of its spines, and then 6 more fake eyes in a pattern on its tail. This means the eye spine probably has a pretty close to 360-degree field of vision, which it could use to detect predators in the distance and get away before they get too close. Cool design, I'll give it a 6 out of 10.
Fe.
Featherfin. The featherfin is a super weird looking veiny fish. To begin with, its body has a very emaciated look to it, allowing you to see every one of its gnarled muscles very clearly. The most interesting part about the featherfin though is obviously that mouth. It kind of looks like a star-nosed mole, which makes sense that the featherfin has no eyes, likely relying on touch more than anything. I think the featherfin's hunting strategy is probably running that big mouth along the floor of the ocean, looking for prey in the sand, but also looking for burrows where it could dig in with the fingers on its mouth and root out whatever is inside. Its mouth is huge and sticks out quite a way, so I'd imagine on the planet it comes from there's probably some pretty deep burrowers. The featherfin just looks so otherworldly to me that I have to give it a 10 out of 10. Finback. The finback is a pretty typical looking fish, I think. It looks like the mahi-mahi fish, which also happens to have a large fin on its back. I'll give it a 2 out of 10. Fingerface. The Fingerface is a little grub-like creature that's face kind of looks like a 3-fingered hand. It probably uses those fingers to dig around through the dirt and find food. Also, assuming it is a grub and will go through metamorphosis, becoming a pupa, it also probably uses that hand to dig a nice spot in to hide as it pupates. 6 out of 10. Flamethorn. The Flamethorn looks a lot like the Coralheart to me. Both of them are very large insects with similar coloring that have these gaps in their bodies. However, the Flamethorn does not have a cute heart shape to its body, so I can't rank it the same as the Coralheart. 5 out of 10. Flapwheel. The flapwheel is another ocean ray that moves by vigorously flapping its little ray wings. It does have this interesting spot on its underside which has no muscle or fat on it, it's just skin and bone. I don't really know what that is. I'll give the flapwheel a 3 out of 10. Flesh leaf. The flesh leaf is a floating filter feeder that looks like a hanging bundle of leaves. Its camo is actually pretty good, although for some reason I can't help but think the flesh leaf would taste good. It looks like it would be sweet tasting, I don't know. 6 out of 10. Fluke. So flukes on Earth are parasitic flatworms, however the fluke in Starfield is a kind of cute fish ray type creature. I don't have too much to say here, 4 out of 10. Flying leech / scepter. The flying leech, also called the scepter, looks kind of similar to the egg sac, although its top part just seems to be a weird looking gas bag. Now about the name, a flying leech sounds super scary, right? But I don't see how this thing could possibly leech off anything, it doesn't even have any mouth parts. Scepter, on the other hand, is an insanely accurate name because does this not look like something you see an evil wizard carrying? Like, it absolutely looks like a scepter. I would rank the flying leech very low, but the fact that it's also called a scepter means I have to give it at least a 7 out of 10. Foxbat. The foxbat is, yeah, kind of a cross between a fox and a bat. Now, it's much larger than either, but it has a fox's face with a bat's ears, thus the name. I think it's kind of built like a kangaroo, although it stands a little more bent over than they do. The foxbat has spines covering its rear end like a porcupine, so I don't know if it could actually stand entirely upright because those spines would get in the way. Also, we have to talk about the fact that this thing has fur and is a mammal. Holy shit, man, some of the rarest traits in the Starfield universe being expressed right here with the foxbat. Due to that, I'll give it an 8 out of 10.
G.
Gekon. The Gekon is a monitor lizard that kind of looks like it has psoriasis. Like, those scales look dry as hell. Besides that, it's a mostly typical monitor lizard. It looks a lot like a Komodo dragon or something. 2 out of 10. Ghost. The ghost is a very interesting looking bat-like creature. I would imagine the reason it's called ghost is because of the insanely low profile this thing has, especially when it's not flying. The ghost has no visible head of any kind and its body is like 90% wing. I can't even really speculate on the biology of the ghost because I really have no idea how this thing works. 8 out of 10. Glider. The glider is another somewhat bat-like creature, although I would say this one is probably a reptile. It has no feathers and kind of has meaty wings along with having no beak to speak of. Besides that, the glider is pretty mid. I'll give it a 5 out of 10. Glowback. The glowback is another flying creature that looks like a cross between a pterosaur and maybe a vulture. It has no feathers to speak of, which I think is pretty disappointing, but I think its face is very vulture-like. As for the coloring, which gives it its name, I would say that's probably to attract mates. Maybe the males look like this while the females look much more boring, as that's usually the pattern among birds. 4 out of 10. Glowhands. The glowhands is a little insect creature that has 2 big forelimbs that look like veiny glowing testicles. Like many creatures in Starfield, it looks like the glowback carries its eggs on its tail, but besides that and its strange looking head, it's more or less just another insect. 5 out of 10. Gossamer. The gossamer is a floating animal that kind of looks like a stack of glowing fungus or maybe coral to me. This is another one where its body acts as the gas bag and doesn't seem to have much structure beyond that. On Earth, jellyfish have what's called a hydrostatic skeleton, which in their case essentially means the only thing giving them any kind of structure is the water they live in. I think the gossamer could be an example of an aerostatic skeleton, maybe a gas-static skeleton. I don't know, but clearly if you punctured its gas bags, it would lose all structure to its body. 7 out of 10. Grabber. The grabber is another ice pod creature that gets its name from the massive mandible on its mouth that it would use to grab prey. The grabber most likely traps prey with his mandibles, then eats them alive. It sounds pretty cruel to us humans, but that's the case with most animals. Very rarely will they expend the extra energy to kill something before they eat it. Anyway, the grabber gets a 5 out of 10. Greater Jaffa Lizard. The Greater Jaffa Lizard looks identical to the dragon except for its coloring and size. Not much else to say besides that. 4 out of 10. Grazing Ensifer. The Grazing Ensifer should have gone in the E section, however I forgot to move the G before I sorted the list, so it's just gonna go in here. Anyway, it looks identical to the cricket, so I also probably should have grouped those two together. 5 out of 10. The grub is a very interesting looking little larva. Its face is extremely armored and its entire back is covered in spikes for protection. The grub has a pretty nasty looking mouth on it, but I very much doubt a little grub like this would be a predator. If I had to guess, I would say maybe it eats the algae off rocks, which is why it has such a hard looking mouth. In real life, chitin do this and their radula is known as the hardest biomineral on the planet. 6 out of 10.
Furry.
Hammersaur. The Hammersaur is the same as the Buzzrunner, although this name is much more fitting than Buzzrunner. 8 out of 10. Heat Leech. The Heat Leech looks a lot like a lamprey to me, which in the real world attach themselves to the size of fish and drink their fluids until the fish dies. The Heat Leech, however, is known to be a pest on every single starship in the galaxy because they feed off heat generated by engines and such. Now that's not a thing on Earth, however chemotrophs are microorganisms that feed off chemicals, and they're often extremophiles too, which means they live in environments where almost nothing else could. Usually extreme heat like underwater vents, or extremely salty water, or even nuclear waste. So where am I going with this? Well, I think the Heat Leech doesn't actually feed off heat, rather it has a gut microbiome made up of chemotrophs, meaning the Heat Leech can attach itself to a starship engine that's probably emitting horrible carcinogens, feeding the chemotrophs in its body which then generate calories for the Heat Leech. Heat Leech also do metamorphosis and turn into pteramorphs, which is a pretty big change, so maybe the constant ingestion of horrible chemicals causing mutations in their genes, which helps with the transformation. 9 out of 10. Hookneck. The hookneck is a crab or maybe lobster that has, of course, a hooked neck that actually seems to hide and protect its sensitive underside. So the entire visible part of the hook neck is covered in a hard shell, while its guts are protected inside the hook neck, which also looks like it's where the hook neck would store its eggs. Its eyes also look pretty cool, so I'll give it a 7 out of 10. Hornface. The Hornface is an extremely ugly giant hermit crab. It has another of those mouths which would be great for digging around in the sand to find burrowing animals, and it also doesn't seem to have eyes, just a lot of feelers. Of course the Hornface gets its name from the massive growth on top of its shell that has 4 horns on it. I believe the reason why it's called Hornface is because that growth is meant to trick predators into thinking that that's its face. So a passing shark or something would go for the hard-shelled horn, giving the crab time to store its actual face back in the shell. 7 out of 10. Horsamander. The Horsamander is insane, like holy shit, look at this thing. I have a lot to say here, but let's begin with the name. So the mander part comes from the fact that this thing is an amphibian, like salamanders. Where does the horse part come from? Well, if you really squint at its head, I guess it kind of looks like a horse. So when it comes to amphibians, some can both breathe air and water, which I believe is the case with the Horsamander. What I believe this thing does is it scuttles around on the bottom of deep lakes and rivers, snatching passing fish with that head it has. This might be my favorite design in the game. 10 out of 10. Ikuradon. So Ikura is a Japanese word for salmon caviar, and if you look at this thing's eyes, you can probably see where they got the name from. It's another massive praying mantis-like insect, although it has a mouth that doesn't look like it could really pierce flesh or shell. So what I think the Acrodon does is rip a hole in you with its claws, then stick that mouth into the wound and drink your fluids. 8 out of 10.
Shay.
Jackknife. The jackknife is another isopod with 2 massive growths on its shell that do somewhat resemble knives, thus the name. It's alright, I'll give it an 8 out of 10. Jellyfin. The jellyfin is a floating jellyfish, enough said right there, but I'll elaborate a little bit. Its head is transparent and there's what looks like blue leaves inside, although I'm not sure what those actually are. It's one of those jellies that has the almost mushroom-looking growth on its tentacles. I don't know much about jellyfish, but you probably wouldn't want to get brushed by those tentacles. 6 out of 10. Kelp Strider. The Kelp Strider is a big sauropod that gets its name due to the kelp hanging off its underside. It clearly enjoys wading through water and probably feasts on certain types of trees that only grow in the water, like mangroves. I think it's also possible that it's more of an ocean strider as it has barnacles growing all over its lower half, which definitely implies that the Kelp Strider spends a significant amount of time in salt water. 6 out of 10. Kreet/Rockhound. The Kreet, also called the Rockhound, is a rare example of a creature with 2 names where both fit it perfectly. Rockhound is very accurate as it is a quadruped creature that looks like a giant rock. Kreet sounds like something the caveman would have called it, like, grab your Kreet, Unga, we go hunting now. Anyway, I can't really fathom what I'm looking at when it comes to the Kreet. It has these holes all along its face which probably serve a dual purpose of breathing and eating. I have no idea what this thing would eat though, so let's just give the Kreet/Rockhound an 8 out of 10. Kronosaurus. The Kronosaurus is fucking massive. It's this huge aquatic reptile with 10 tentacles on it rather than fins. Now it does look like the real dinosaur Kronosaurus, except for those tentacles. As far as I can tell, that's not a thing any fish or reptile ever developed in our world. I guess this would allow the Kronosaurus to drag itself along the ocean floor like an octopus, or maybe even drag itself onto land to catch prey up there. That's a pretty terrifying thought. 7 out of 10.
Only one and one do one.
Lacrea. The Lacrea is almost like a land shrimp or maybe crayfish. It looks really crazy. The most obvious trait is that massive claw above its mouth, which is very interesting to me because I don't think that claw could actually reach to its mouth. It doesn't look like it could bend enough, so maybe the claw is purely for defensive purposes. Its tail also looks like it might be capable of stinging, so that's another defensive mechanism. I think it's likely that the Lacrea eats leaves and fruit off trees like a giraffe, as I don't see why else it would need to be so damn tall. 8 out of 10. Land Shark. The land shark has a super funny name because it's basically a grasshopper with a head shaped like a shark's head. So like yeah, the name is accurate, but I imagine when you hear land shark, you probably had a different image in your head. 7 out of 10. Leaf Bug. The leaf bug does kind of look like a leaf, however the big problem here is this thing is fucking gigantic and there's no way it could ever pass as a leaf unless the predators on its planet are just really stupid or have really poor eyesight. 5 out of 10. Leaf Strider. The Leaf Strider also doesn't really look like a leaf other than its ears. What I thought was interesting here is that 4 of its 8 legs are just dangling there uselessly. So it could be a situation where the Leaf Strider is slowly evolving into a species that would have 4 legs, or it uses them for something else, like mating or maybe clinging onto trees. Also 5 out of 10. Leecher. The Leecher is a reptile that looks a lot like a cross between a naked mole rat and a star-nosed mole. However, given its name, I think we can guess it has a different diet than those animals. I would guess the Leecher attaches itself onto some giant creature and sucks their fluids out like a lamprey. The only thing is that whatever it leeches off would have to be pretty big not to notice, or just not be able to remove the Leecher from its back. Interesting to think about. 6 out of 10. Lion Bear. The lion bear looks neither like a lion or a bear, and is in fact a reptile that looks exactly like the Alshta. 1 out of 10. Lionfish. The lionfish has a pretty puzzling name because it looks nothing like the lionfish here on Earth, and instead looks like a stingray. The interesting thing about the lionfish is this glowing orange ball on its underside, which I think, is its mouth. Maybe the lionfish filter feeds and this ball only allows through plankton while rejecting other potentially harmful microorganisms like parasites. I'm really just guessing though. 6 out of 10. Lockjaw. The lockjaw is a massive 6-eyed reptile that has a mouth like a snapping turtle. Some snapping turtles can actually lock their jaws, which it seems this thing could do as well. Now with most snappers on Earth, the worst you have to worry about is losing a finger or two, but this thing could easily execute you in one bite. Pretty cool. 6 out of 10. Long Arm. The long arm is the next spider with massive forelimbs, and this is the one I was talking about when I said not all were lucky enough to have their eyes in good placements. The long arm's eyes are on the side of its head, basically pressed up against its claws. Its actual claws are basically blunt weapons compared to the others with this layout, so I would guess this one is less of a hunter than they are. I'll give it a 6 out of 10. Longhorn. The longhorn is a little crab that I guess gets its name from the stinger on its back because besides that it's pretty much a typical looking hermit crab. They do have 6 appendages coming out of their face which I think might be used to pry open mollusks to eat, but besides that there's not much going on for the longhorn. 3 out of 10. Long neck. The long neck looks like a gigantic chicken sauropod. Honestly, this is the one they should have named cockatrice in my opinion. Maybe the long neck has a similar diet to a chicken, which is essentially anything it can fit its beak around. I'll give it a 7 out of 10. Loxodont. The Loxodont looks insane. This is another where I don't even know where to start. So on its body are these 5 openings that I think look like nostrils, meaning the Loxodont might breathe through its body. Its head is by far the most interesting part though, because it also kind of looks like a lamprey. So what this leads me to believe that the Loxodon's hunting strategy is to cut a hole in its prey's side with that mouth, then plunge that head inside to eat their guts all the while breathing through its body. This thing is huge by the way, so as long as it could catch its prey, they're pretty much done for. 10 out of 10. Lurefish. The lurefish is pretty odd looking. Its dorsal fins look like mushrooms, but I don't think that's the lure the name is referencing. Rather, I think the lure are these two fake eyes on the front of its body, because you can see that its real head is this little outcropping on the front of the body. Maybe the fake eyes are even filled with some kind of toxic substance so that when a predator attacks, it bites into the fake eyes and gets poisoned. 8 out of 10.
M.
Maggot Maw. So all the maggot maws I tried to spawn had this stupid camouflage where we can only see their outline, so we'll have to consult YouTube footage from Manu Games 92. So the maggot maw is clearly a giant insect creature that has a mouth lined with razor sharp teeth. They're fucking massive too, and you can easily see how if one of these things got its hands on you, you'd end up meeting those maggots in its maw face to face. Their bodies are really weird and bulbous, and I think they may even hold their larvae in there, as you can see the little holes all over their big bodies. 8 out of 10. Marnock. The Marnock is our next sauropod adjacent animal, except it has these beautiful translucent fins on it. I'll give it a 6 out of 10. Mayfly. The mayfly is a massive flying insect that doesn't really resemble the earth bug it's named after, but it is pretty cool. The mayfly kind of just glides through the air, so we can guess that it also has some form of internal gas bags to keep it up. 5 out of 10. Metropus. The Metropus, or maybe Metropus, is a floating squid jellyfish-like creature that has a translucent head, allowing you to see these weird organs inside. I'm not entirely sure what those are. It could be the Metropus's brain, or perhaps its animal photosynthesizes, which is why it needs that see-through head. The rest of it is just a massive tentacles coiled around a central one. I'll give it a 7 out of 10. Milliwhale. The milliwhale is super cute. It's not really a millipede, but it is a cute little crawling insect that has patterns that make it look like a whale. Super cute. 7 out of 10. Monitor. The monitor looks like a semi-aquatic reptile to me. You can see its arms end in nubs, which would obviously be better for swimming, but it also has very well-developed hind legs for running. Maybe what we're seeing here is a creature in the middle of evolving from a fully aquatic reptile to a fully terrestrial one. It's pretty. I'll give it a 6 out of 10. Morian. The Morian is a little caterpillar snail type thing with another heavily armored head. It looks a lot like the Grub. 5 out of 10. Morningstar. The Morningstar is another ray adjacent fish, but it has so many goddamn eyes. Like, what could it possibly need to see that bad? Maybe the Morningstar comes from extremely murky water, which is why it needs eyes on every single part of its wings. 8 out of 10. Mosasaur/Mossnath. The Mosasaur and the Mossnath are the same sauropod-like creature that gets its name from the plants growing on its back. Mostly moss, but you can see a couple sticks coming out of there. I think the only benefit the moss provides it is with better camouflage. However, I think it's probably just a result of the plants the creature spends most of its time eating, getting their revenge by making the creature unwittingly spread their seeds/spores. 7 out of 10. Mothwing. The Mothwing is a little flying moth, perhaps even the one the caterpillar were turned into. It's pretty, but moths are another group of animals where it's hard to outdo what we already have here on Earth. 3 out of 10.
On in the one anymore. It bit you not worse.
Nailtail. The Nailtail has a super deadly looking tail that looks like a mace, which you would guess is for defense, however this thing definitely looks like a predator to me. It has 6 eyes and pretty deadly looking teeth, so you have to wonder what it needs that tail to protect itself from. 7 out of 10. Nautilus. The Nautilus really should have just been called the Nautilus, but that name was already taken by a bird, so they had to give this really goofy spelling instead. Now, Nautilus on Earth already float around in the water using an organ called a siphuncle, which keeps them buoyant, so I guess it's not a huge stretch that elsewhere in the galaxy they could use that siphuncle to float. The interesting thing here is that 1, it has very long tentacles, and 2 is that it's super hostile and will go straight after the player. So the Nautilus must be a pretty prolific predator on its home planet. 7 out of 10. Nautilus. Now for the Nautilus, which gets its name from the fact that its body is shaped like the shell of a Nautilus. It's actually a pretty cool looking pterosaur thing. It's very bony, and you have to wonder how this adaptation even developed on its own planet. What did it need a shell like that to protect itself from? 7 out of 10. Nightmare/Twintail. I can imagine some settlers from New Atlantis or whatever landing on a bright new planet, set down their roots and start a new society, only to see these things and instantly name them nightmares. It is a very scary looking creature. Now, it is also called the Twintail elsewhere, but that's lame, so we're sticking with Nightmare. So to begin with, the Nightmare has these veins or maybe intestines wrapped around the outside of its body, as well as these tube-looking openings on its side. So maybe the Nightmare can spray poison or digestive juices on its prey. It has these bumps all over the back of its head, but I'm not entirely sure what those are. Maybe it's eggs. Its face is also a nightmare, just a massive big black insectoid eyes. 10 out of 10. Noid. I bet if I asked you to imagine an animal called the Noid, it probably wouldn't be this, but it would be likely just as goofy. It's a two-headed insect creature, except it's basically just a tube, so each head would have to act both as a mouth and an anus, or maybe it's one or the other, and the anus has teeth purely for protection. I think this thing is definitely a burrower. One head would dig into the ground while using the other one to set a trap at the top of the burrow. There's a later animal called the Twin Grub, which has the same body layout, so I think it's possible that the Twin Grub grows into the Noid. 8 out of 10.
Oh, we did.
Octomaggot. The octo maggot is a big fat-legged, 8-eyed maggot. I mean, what else were you expecting? I think this thing could easily turn into any of the various foul fly creatures we've seen so far, maybe the arachnofly since they both share certain crab-like traits. 6 out of 10. Olgreg. The Olgreg is a reptile, maybe a turtle-like thing, that has a massive growth on the top of its head, which seems pointless until you realize the Olgreg has constant shade for its eyes. 6 out of 10. Orchid. The orchid is super weird looking, so its body is more or less typical, but everything about that head is just crazy. It has 2 massive hollow horns which I think may act as sound amplifiers, so any sounds coming from above the orchid would be amplified through the horns and then hit the orchid's ears. It almost looks like it has 2 heads, one facing forward and one facing up. All this leads me to believe the orchid comes from a planet with some pretty crazy looking flyers on it, meaning that this creature has to constantly have an eye on the sky. 9 out of 10.
Pianawarin, Edwarn, Po.
Paddlefish / rainbow agnathan. The paddlefish is a sturgeon looking fish that has some extra fins. It's also called rainbow agnathan, but it doesn't really have a rainbow pattern. I imagine when humans spread their filth to whatever planet the paddlefish come from, they'll be hunted to near extinction for alien caviar, like real world sturgeon. 4 out of 10. Parrothawk. The parrothawk is more or less a pterosaur that has a face of a very fierce looking parrot. I mean, these things just look evil. They're apex predators and hunt in flocks, so stay inside when you see them coming. 5 out of 10. Pearl. The pearl is another floating jellyfish that I believe gets its name from the little pearls floating around inside its head. Besides that, it is another floating filter feeder, which we've seen a lot of by now, so I'll give it a 5 out of 10. Pinecone. The pinecone has very good camo. I mean, I could barely see them in the field I spawned them in. They're little snail creatures that do resemble a pinecone, well enough to deceive even me. 6 out of 10. Plateskin. The plateskin is another grasshopper-like insect, this one with extremely thick plates over its skin. Duh. Something about that grasshopper body shape just must be evolutionarily perfect because there are so many of these. 5 out of 10. Prong-wing seabat. The prong-wing seabat not only has prongs on its wings, but each prong is a little hand, which is a very unique layout. Its head is also pretty unique and has 4 eyes on the end of each side of its head. It looks to me like a very alien form of a bat, so it probably uses those extra hands to cling onto cave ceilings and climb around. The prong-wing seabat also comes in a tiny form simply called the seabat. 7 out of 10.
Achawar.
Red Mile Mauler. So if you haven't played Starfield, specifically the Freestar Rangers questline, you probably aren't going to follow what I'm talking about. But in that quest you go to this backwater casino where they allow you to bet that you can survive the Red Mile, a stretch of land so perilous that almost no one does survive. They warn you of the massive fearsome Red Mile Maulers that'll attack you the whole way, so you get all hyped up ready to face whatever giant creature awaits, only to find out that it's yet another lizard wolf. Super disappointing. I mean, imagine if you had to face hordes of nightmares or something. Now that would be scary. As it is though, the Red Mile Mauler is a pretty boring reptile. 3 out of 10. Reefwalker. The Reefwalker is a pretty weird looking animal. It has these tubes all over its back, head, and even its fingers are tubes. So based off its name, we can guess the animal probably hunts at coral reefs. So maybe those tubes are like a snorkeling setup to allow it to breathe while hunting underwater. I also think it's possible their main purpose is to make sounds to attract mates for the Reefwalker. Either way, it's a good design. 8 out of 10. Roundface. The roundface is the next grasshopper, and kind of like the land shark, its main distinction is that it has a unique face. It also has rudimentary fingers, which is pretty interesting. 6 out of 10. Roundshell. The roundshell is a massive hermit crab that has its face tucked in deep into its shell, which ends in a big spike that it could use to keep predators away. Its claws are also long enough to allow it to grab into spaces that its big shell wouldn't allow it to. 7 out of 10.
Suri Warsituan.
Sailgator. The sailgator is a reptile with a huge mouth like a gator, and a sail on its back that looks like it could extend out and make the sailgator look much bigger than it actually is. It's probably both a defense mechanism and a mating display if I had to guess. 6 out of 10. Saturnine. The Saturnine is a very weird looking ray creature that's entire face is covered in these big yellow bulbs with these small appendages sticking out. The appendages kind of look like anemones to me, so I think they're probably some kind of lure. If I really had to guess, I would say the very slow moving Saturnine will maybe even lay down on the seafloor, making its weird head look like a normal coral colony. So then when fish and other small animals try to move in and claim their spots, they end up going inside these appendages only to be trapped and digested. That's just my idea though. 8 out of 10. Sawhead. The sawhead is a very weird looking fish that's way bigger and less aerodynamic than the sawfish we have here on Earth. I really can't fathom what I'm looking at when it comes to the sawfish's body. Like, I genuinely have no idea why it might be shaped like that. 7 out of 10. Scarab. The scarab is another grasshopper-like insect that doesn't really look like the scarab beetles we have here on Earth. Maybe it's named that because it comes from very sandy environments, so when scientists saw it, they just decided on scarab. 5 out of 10. Scorpion. The scorpion is kind of a scorpion, I guess, although it has no tail or stinger and instead has this big body that juts upwards. Its body kind of looks like a skull, which is cool, I guess, but besides that, there's not much going on here. 4 out of 10. Sea hag. The sea hag has a head that looks like the brain squid, actually. Besides that, it's another ray-adjacent creature that seems to have a mouth that looks like an asshole. Now on Earth, manta rays are known to be the smartest of the fish, so I wouldn't be surprised if the sea hag is actually extremely smart due to that giant brain it has. Now obviously it wouldn't be smart in a human way, like it couldn't do your taxes, but I mean, can you do your taxes without any help? 7 out of 10. Seahorse. The seahorse has a deceiving name. See, I thought it would be an actual seahorse, so I spawned it in the ocean, only for it to be a giraffe-looking thing and start drowning. Anyway, it does have the skin texture of a seahorse, which is where it got the name, but that's very clearly a land animal. An interesting adaptation. I mean, I guess it could help it blend in with rocks. 6 out of 10. Sentinel. The Sentinel is another very weird-looking ray that's most defining feature is the massive tusk coming out of its mouth, like a narwhal. Now, the thing about narwhal tusks is the scientists change their mind on what they use the tusk for like every other year, so I feel confident saying that we have no idea what the Sentinel would do with that thing either. 9 out of 10. Shardhopper. The Shardhopper is a little cricket-looking bug that has a very sharp and angular look to it, thus the name. It's pretty, but there are so many bugs with this layout in Starfield. Like, where are the centipedes or the roaches or anything that's not a spider, beetle, or grasshopper? 4 out of 10. Shark whale. The shark whale is really just a shark the size of a whale. Initially I thought it might be a whale because it has no dorsal fin, however the shark whale has gills, meaning it breathes water, disqualifying it from being a whale at all. Unlike the real-world whale shark, basking shark, and megamouth shark, which are the 3 biggest sharks we have, this thing is a predator with a mouthful of razor-sharp teeth. You would definitely not want to get bitten by that thing. 7 out of 10. Elephant. The shellphant is more or less what you'd expect, an alien elephant with a shell. Judging by the looks of the shell, I'd say the shellphant probably builds its own shell out of rocks, maybe the bark of certain trees on its own planet. The shellphant's face is also of note because it has 8 eyes, and like normal elephants, its mouth is inside of the trunk rather than under it. Pretty cute though, 8 out of 10. Shield shell. The shield shell looks kind of like a giant walking clam. Inside of its shell are these little bulbs, which I'm not entirely sure what those are, but its face is down on the bottom while that upper part seems to be entirely for protection. It has a massive tail too that looks like it could do some damage if the shield shell hits you with it. 8 out of 10. Shroom head. The shroom head is pretty odd looking, so to begin with it has these stalks growing all over its body with a pitch black orb on the end of them. You might think these are its eyes, and I'll admit that might be possible, but then what are the black orbs growing over its body and head? I think one set of these black spots are a decoy while the other are its real eyes, but I have no idea which is which. 8 out of 10. Silverfish. The silverfish is a very large, maybe shrimp looking thing that does not at all resemble the bug it's named after. I say shrimp mainly because of that face, but I definitely wouldn't commit to this thing being any kind of crustacean. To be honest with you, I don't know what I'm looking at here, and that's a good thing. 9 out of 10. Siren. Now I'm going to go on kind of a tangent with the Siren. If you haven't played Starfield, you won't know what I'm waffling about. Back when I first played this game, I thought they said the Sirens were Xenor weapons created by the United Colonies. I was like 100% sure that's what they were, but I just started looking into it and I can't find anything about that online. Like during the UC Colony questline, you have to go to that one planet with the destroyed mechs everywhere, and there's Sirens all over because the UC deployed them there, right? I don't know man, maybe I'm just stupid. Anyway, the Siren is another quadruped lizard that has 3 massive sets of ears on it, so this thing would hear you from possibly miles away. They don't seem to have eyes and rely purely on sound, so if these things were naturally occurring, their prey would have to be pretty light-footed. 7 out of 10. Skullface. The Skullface looks like a giant piranha to me, just with a little more of a grim look to it. That mouth could definitely take a chunk out of something though. 5 out of 10. Sloth. The sloth is a big 6-limbed creature that does look a lot like the giant ground sloths we used to have here on Earth. Just like the sloths we have here, it actually has algae growing on its back, although on Earth that's because of how slow-moving sloths are. These guys really aren't that slow. My only complaint here is that Bethesda is still allergic to giving fur to their aliens, so it only gets a 5 out of 10. Snail. The snail, or maybe herding snail, is a little shelled mollusk, yes. It has more of a sea snail look to it than a land snail, but it is indeed a snail. I should have recorded that thing in the daytime though, as I can't see shit. 5 out of 10. Snuffler. The Snuffler is fucking horrifying, man. I mean, what the hell is that? It looks like a big skull sitting there with a trunk. Like, look at that bone structure, man. So let's begin with those giant milky eyes, which honestly don't look like they would see much. It has the aforementioned trunk, which would be used to shove food into its mouth, which is right there. It also has nostrils right on the trunk, making it look like a big nose. All in all, the Snuffler is a very horrifying slug creature that gets a 10 out of 10 from me. Space Roach. The Space Roach is a big skittering insect that has a massive tail full of what look to be its eggs. I think it's called the Space Roach because it would probably reproduce very easily, so if one of these got onto your ship without you knowing, you'd suddenly have hundreds of them running around. 4 out of 10. Spider Wasp. The Spider Wasp is the next spider with massive forelimbs, and in this case I think it's called that, because the forelimbs end in a point which would probably pierce you if it hit you right. The Spider Wasp has 6 eyes they can actually see out of due to its smaller forelimbs, so I'll give it a 6 out of 10. Spike Worm. The Spike Worm is a big bulbous worm with spikes all over its back. It also has one of these hard mouths that can scrape food off rocks. Enough said, 5 out of 10. Spore. The spore looks like a floating COVID particle. I don't know what else to say besides that. 8 out of 10. Spore back. The spore back looks insane. So to begin with, it has fur, which we have to give Bethesda credit for. I know that was hard for them. It also has a very goofy looking face, but of course the biggest trait here is the giant fucking hole on its back. It's called Sporeback, so we can either say that it takes spores into its back, maybe to eat, or it sends spores out from its back. I think the latter is probably more likely, but I seriously doubt a mammal like the Sporeback would reproduce through actual spores. I think when threatened, the Sporeback can probably shoot out a cloud of spores to stun their attacker and give them time to get away. Either way, really crazy design, 10 out of 10. Stingback. The Stingback is a pretty fierce looking crab that we can assume uses that point on the end of its shell as a thrusting weapon. I don't think it would actually inject anything through the stinger, but it would still do some damage. The Stingback has quite a set of teeth on it, so maybe it uses the stinger to wound its prey, then pounces on them. 6 out of 10. Stingray. The Stingray is a very alien looking stingray. It holds its eggs in a pouch right under its head, which is where the Earth stingrays would have their actual mouth be. It has more of a bill though, which probably uses to catch small fish. Unlike real world rays, it has more skeletal appearance to it, but all in all I like it. 7 out of 10. Stonewalker. I don't think I need to tell you how the Stonewalker got its name, but it looks somewhat similar to the Rockhound, which is to say that it looks like a rock. It's massive though and has these tentacles all over what I presume would be its mouth. So the Stonewalker would put whatever the hell it eats into those tentacles where they would do something. Like the Rockhound, this thing is so alien it's hard to even speculate on its behavior. 9 out of 10. Sunfish. The sunfish is a pretty typical looking stingray. I wish they would have based it more off Earth sunfish because they are very weird and goofy looking animals. 2 out of 10. Sunflower. The sunflower is a spider-like creature that has these massive spikes branching out from what seems to be a hole in its body. They do kind of look like the petals of a flower, I guess. I just don't know what this massive hole is for. Maybe reproduction. 6 out of 10.
C. Dartinianer. Westetin.
Tapeworm. The tapeworm floats, and that sounds super scary if this thing was like an earth tapeworm. Like imagine a gigantic 16-foot long tapeworm that could just float directly into your mouth. Fortunately for us, this tapeworm is probably not parasitic and I don't even think it's a worm. It looks much more reptilian to me. It has a face like a frog and its body is inflated to allow it to float around like that. I would guess the tapeworm's diet consists of smaller, slower floating creatures that it could gulp up with very little difficulty. I'll give it a 7 out of 10. Tentabeard. The Tentabeard is a reptilian herbivore that does have tentacle-like growths coming off its chin, however more interesting are the breathing holes on its neck. They look a lot like gills. It's interesting because the Tentabeard also has nostrils which you could presumably breathe out of as well, so I don't really see the point of the air gills. 5 out of 10. Terrormorph. Terrormorphs are the final form of the heat leech. They have 6 legs, 2 sets of 4 legs that can be used for hitting and grabbing, and 2 back legs for running. The Terrormorph still has kind of an exoskeleton over its really just external ribs and a spine. It has these pulsating like blobs on its back which I think might carry heat leech eggs. Besides that, it retains a pretty insect-looking head. Terrormorphs are menaces and have been known to wipe out entire colonies of humans on planets where they show up, which is almost everywhere as remember they evolved from heat leeches, which sneak their way onto almost every ship. Terrormorphs come from the same planet as the Aciles where they were actually preyed upon by the giant reptiles. When humans wiped out the Aciles for food though, the Terrormorphs on their home planet got to be so numerous, they overran the cities and military bases of the planet. Over the course of decades, heat leeches will naturally turn into Terrormorphs, however on their home planet there's a plant called the Lazarus plant which instantly causes the transformation. So I believe the Terrormorph life cycle to be this. Heat leech is born, it leeches off heat sources for a while until they've grown enough to migrate towards underground caves where the Lazarus plant grows. There they transform into a Terrormorph and mate with the other newly transformed Terrormorphs. They then leave the cave to go live as a big scary insect until the new heat leeches hatch from their back and the cycle begins anew. I said before that Terrormorphs have mind control, but that's kind of an exaggeration. However, they can cause delusion and mania in humans, causing them to go crazy and attack everything in sight. I think that if those spots on its back aren't eggs, then it's probably the organ that produces the gas that causes the delusion in humans. Super cool animal. I mean, there's a reason why they're the main villain of the whole questline. 10 out of 10. Thorn. The thorn is another ice pod that has a big growth on top of its shell that seems to be a fake head. It even has fake eyes and a mouth. I can say confidently that it's fake because you can see the thorn gathering food from another place on the underside of its shell. So while predators were attacking the fake head, the thorn could probably coil up or dig itself to safety. 4 out of 10. Thorn mantis. The thorn mantis is a very large 6-eyed praying mantis that does look like a thorny plant. Its antennae even look like sticks. There are actually a lot of mantises in real life that use crazy camera like this, such as the flower mantis which looks like a beautiful flower to attract prey to it. 7 out of 10. Toadface. The Toadface is another quadruped reptile that has a short stout face that looks like a toad. Its mouth also seems to be toothless, meaning the Toadface would likely swallow its prey whole. 6 out of 10. Tongueface. The Tongueface looks horrifying. So to begin with, it kind of looks like the Stonewalker or Rockhound, however it's much larger with a more sauropod shape to it. Its body is very large and blocky and it has those same segmented growths on it that we've seen a lot in Starfield. Of course the most obvious thing is its face. So the Tongueface has no eyes or nose and barely even has a mouth. It just has a big hole in its face with a massive tongue coming out of it. I think the Tongueface probably eats insects with that tongue, like an anteater for example. It would be able to stretch up the trees and run that tongue along every single branch, catching whatever insects live there to eat. 10 out of 10. Really crazy design. Trapmaw. The Trapmaw is a rare example of a quadruped lizard in this game that actually has a cool design. Its mouth is massive and has these appendages on the other side that it would use to trap prey in its mouth. Trapmaw doesn't seem to have any kind of teeth in there, so I think it's possible it swallows its prey whole like a snake, or maybe secretes digested juices to first soften them up. 8 out of 10. Tri-antler. The tri-antler is a small mammal that does have fur, so that's a big plus, but it has 3 sets of antlers, with an eye on each of them. It has even more small antlers on its tail, which it could use for defense if it sees a predator, which I would hope it would with that many eyes. 8 out of 10. Trident. The trident is a beetle creature that has a big growth on its head that looks like a trident. Now I don't really know where the trident's eyes are. It could be the 2 on the trident, or they could be fake like the thorn. I also think the weird organ on the front of its face could be its eyes, but I really have no idea. Same with those brush-like mouth parts. 7 out of 10. Trihorn. The trihorn is an ox-like mammal that has 3 horns rather than the 2 they have on Earth. It's pretty small and fast-moving, so while the horns are definitely for defense, I would also say that male trihorn like to butt heads with each other over mates, like goats. 4 out of 10. Trilobite. The trilobite is named after the ancient and highly successful arthropods that look a lot like modern-day horseshoe crabs. This thing doesn't really look like them, although there were like 20,000 trilobite species, so it might have fit right in back in the day. The only thing to know here is its sucker-like mouth that it could use to pick up food off the ground. 4 out of 10. Tusk frog. Tusk frog looks pretty intimidating in my opinion. It has 6 legs, the back 2 being the ones it uses for jumping, although they're backwards from what earth frogs have. It has 6 insect-like eyes on its face along with the titular tusks. The tusk frog also has what look like nostrils on its back, which would allow it to hide underwater, leaving only its back above water and breathing through those nostrils. 7 out of 10. Tube crawler. The tube crawler is another one where you're just like, what the hell even is that? So its body is made up of 7 different hollow tubes which have even more tubes inside of them. I think these might be an organ used to allow the tube crawler to move, like by inflating or deflating those they could crawl across the ground. It has no eyes either, just giant nostrils which presumably take in the air needed for those tubes. I think this thing is probably a filter feeder and probably is meant to be in the water, as I don't really see how this thing could survive on land. 9 out of 10. Tubule. The tubule is no less weird than the tube crawler. It's essentially a big mass of tubes coming from a central slug-like body, which has a bunch of either eyes or air holes all over it for inflating or deflating the tube. That tube that sticks up in the air I think might be its nostril if those black spots are eyes, or its anus if they're not. Real snails have their anus pretty much right above their face, so anytime they shit it just drips down their face, and I think this might be a similar situation. It also has these 2 little forelimbs that have holes in them, so it's likely that's where it gathers its food from. Really strange animal. 9 out of 10. Twigwalker. The twigwalker is a big insect that looks like a moving set of bamboo shoots. It has a mouth on it, kind of like a water bug, which says to me that it's a predator, so the camera is used to either attract prey or sneak up on them. 6 out of 10. Twin grub. The twin grub is the animal I said earlier I think might turn into the Noid. It has the same body layout, that being 2 heads, 1 on each side, and it looks pretty embryonic to me. Like I said with the Noid, I think this thing probably uses 1 head to burrow while keeping the other one facing up like a trap, so that anything that falls in can be eaten by 1 head and shat out by the other. 8 out of 10. Twistfin. The twistfin is another I spawned in the water because it sounds like a fish to me, however it's actually a big predatory dinosaur that gets its name due to the blue fins that twist around its body. It does seem to have gills, so maybe the twistfin is both terrestrial and aquatic. 6 out of 10.
Ooh.
Unishark. The unishark is an alien narwhal. Its name comes from unicorn shark, however that's clearly a whale. It even has a blowhole. Anyway, narwhal horns are actually a very overgrown tooth from their mouth. Male narwhals don't have a horn when they're young and they don't even really have a place for the horn to go. The tooth just grows and grows until it pierces the skin above their mouth and becomes the giant horn we all know and love. The unishark seems to be the same way, except its horn comes out from the bottom of its mouth. Now, it is just an alien narwhal, but narwhals are cool, so I'll give it a 7 out of 10.
Surface your meaning and master.
Vampire. The vampire is a flying bat-like animal that has an armored head that kind of looks like a helmet. It's pretty sick, honestly. As for the name vampire, maybe it gets the name from the fact that it drinks blood like vampire bats. I don't know. 6 out of 10. Vectorback. The vectorback is a very large reptile that has a massive shell on its back. The vectorback has a very interesting looking face too. It looks pretty turtle-like in my opinion. They obviously aren't turtles now, but I wouldn't be surprised if at some point in their evolutionary history they looked a little more turtle-like. 7 out of 10. Vulture. The vulture is not a big ugly flying bird, but it is a big ugly walking reptile that has a face kind of like a vulture. Its head is a completely different color than the rest of its body. I think this may be because it has a diet like a vulture. That is to say that it eats corpses that it can scavenge, usually after they started decomposing. So I wouldn't be surprised if a young vulture has an entirely green body, but their head turns to that brown color after years of eating out of rotting bodies. 7 out of 10. Vuvuzelisk. The Vuvuzelisk is named after the Vuvuzela instrument. This is because I believe the Vuvuzelisk uses its many hollow horns to make music. Here you see one about to get mauled by a coral crab, so its song is pretty distressed. However, I imagine if you found a herd of these things, they'd probably be playing a pretty beautiful tune. Very strange looking animal. 8 out of 10.
Fortsätt för nin demoniarton nin mountain.
Wiggler. The Wiggler is a snake, question mark, light creature that gets named due to the fact that it just wiggles its way across the landscape. Snakes on Earth have a variety of ways of moving, such as using their ribs to walk, so I don't think it's too crazy for the Wiggler to be a snake. It could also be a slug, but that face doesn't look at all like any slug I've ever seen. 7 out of 10. Windbag. The windbag is a spider-like insect that has a big inflated back, although it doesn't float around, so I don't know why it's called that. It has a very non-spider-like head, which is why I can't really call this thing a spider. 4 out of 10. Wobbleback. The wobbleback is a big monitor lizard that has massive spines on its back, which may be because it's a wobble when it walks sometimes, I don't know. 3 out of 10.
X.
Xenogrub. Xenogrub are really small, squirming little grubs that you can actually see everywhere in Starfield. Maybe they're the larval form of something like the coral bug, since you also see those pretty frequently. 5 out of 10. And that was all the aliens in Starfield. Maybe. I don't know, man, there's like 3 different Starfield wikis, I can't say for sure I got them all. This video took me quite a while to make, but it was really fun talking about fake animals and how they might behave. Thank you all so much for watching.